part 3 of the 9th grade world history review from early man to the Renaissance. And we are continuing where we were from before. We covered Greek and Roman times last time, and where we stopped was the beginnings of Christianity. And that is where we shall move next. Christianity, as you probably are aware of, is perhaps the most important of Rome's heritage to us, because Christianity changed the face of the world for good and also for ill in some parts of the world. Regardless of anything, the world would not be the same without the advent of Christianity. Now, in this school especially, where we have so many different religions, different faiths, most people really don't understand how Christianity works. Many people who say they are Christians may not have a full understanding of the origins of their religion. So I'm going to try to begin at the beginning to give you the idea that you need. Christianity has its roots in two places. The first is in Judaism. Now, Judaism, as most of you are aware of, was the first of the major religions that was born in the Fertile Crescent, in what is now Israel or Palestine. Judaism has the same patriarch, that is to say, or the same origins, in fact, that Islam and Christianity have. The belief was that there was a founder named Abraham who had started the religion. His successors later on claimed that they had revelations from God or up in the heavens and so forth of moral laws and ways that all of us should live by. Jews take Moses as one of the main founders of Judaism. Christianity and Islam look at Moses as an important figure. The story was that the Jews were held in captivity in Egypt, and it was under Moses that they were able to escape captivity. By the way, archaeologists have checked and had been looking in the area for many, many years to see whether or not this story is true, but most scholars, even religious Jewish scholars, said that this is a myth. There were really it looks like there probably was never a Moses, and there's no evidence at all of a Jewish captivity. Even so, the story is one that has kept Jews alive and thriving literally for many centuries. From the Bible, or from the Torah, which is the Jewish religious books, they claim that Moses was given commandments from God on how everyone should behave. The famous 10 Commandments. Christianity, and to a lesser extent Islam, have adopted them as well. Judaism eventually took their writings, put them together in a work that they call the Torah. Most of you are very familiar with that. In Christianity, the Torah is called the Old Testament, and is the story of the Jews and their fighting and their work. The most important aspect of Judaism that you need to understand was they were among the first to come up with the concept that there is one God, as opposed to many gods. There is evidence that shows that Judaism originally was a religion with many, many different gods, and eventually it evolved to the point where they said these gods that we had before are false, and there is only the one God, whom they called Yahweh. This also was combined with an idea that most other religions didn't have, that there was a personal pact or agreement between the Jewish people and God. The idea was the Jewish people are supposed to uphold God's law, and in return, God would protect the Jewish people and help them to thrive. You can take that for what it might be worth. Jews eventually settled in the land of Canaan, which is now the area around the Fertile Crescent. They established a large empire in time. Jewish beliefs include the following: the need for justice. There is only anyone who does not get justice is wronged. It means relationships between people, humans, need to be fair. And if someone is wronged, right must be made. Second thing, to act with piety. That is to say, do the right thing at all times. If there's an easy way out, don't take that easy way. Go the hard way, because if it's right, it's what you need to do. If you, for example, find $1,000 in a wallet, and in that wallet is the identification of the person who lost $1,000, to act with piety means it is incumbent upon you to return that money, even if you need it more than that person. That is sometimes very, very different to do. To act in a way that brings peace, I think that's self-explanatory. Actions must be pervaded with compassion. That means when one does something, it must be done because one feels for the needs of the other people. One does not help someone simply because you're going to get something. You are helping someone because, again, it's the right thing to do. You feel for that person. You understand and identify with that person's humanity. Judaism has specific dietary laws. For example, Jews or religious Jews are not supposed to be eating ham, not supposed to mix certain foods together, and so forth. It is believed that the dietary laws came about because of unsanitary conditions of certain animals, and if you ate them, you would get sick. And so they just said, let's not bother eating this stuff at all. Nowadays, Jews look at dietary laws as a self-discipline, sort of like a person who wants to be a vegetarian. That's a type of self-discipline. And lastly, I believe on this list is the observance of Shabbat. That is to say, the observance of one day in Saturday as a day of rest. Most of you are probably familiar with that. Oh, I did have more. The seventh of the Jewish belief is that we have a responsibility to the community. It's not just you. It's just not me. You know, what is it for number one? When I do something, I must look at the world. I must look at my family. I must look at my friends. I must look at my country. I must look at the world, because the community is all we really have. And as time has gone on, the community has meant the whole wide world, and even people of different religions or faith. There's the idea of a mitzvah, which is a good deed commanded by God. Even today, Jews who are, you could argue, are atheists, who don't believe in God, believe in doing good for others. Charity, it's a mitzvah. Working to help a person read, it's a mitzvah. Rescuing a cat from a tree. All of these are good deeds. And one does it not because they want to get anything out of it. That breaks the idea of rule number 4, but because it's the right thing to do and something that you would want done for yourself. Israel at its height encompassed a large area. Today it would include parts of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and so forth. About 2,000 years ago, the kingdoms of the kingdom of Israel split due to differences in religious beliefs, and 2 kingdoms were then established: the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Eventually, however, the kingdom of Israel would be invaded by conquerors from the north, leaving Judah by itself. And eventually, by the time we come to the Roman Empire, Judah is conquered by the Romans, and eventually the territory has been divided up. Jews, after that, no longer had a nation for themselves and were forced to go out into the world. But it is from this land under Roman control that we get the beginnings of the second major religion, which would become, of course, Christianity. And there we go. Christianity would eventually would end up not only overtaking Judaism in that part of the world, but eventually would spread all over. Most of you are probably familiar with the life of Jesus. It is believed that at his 30th year he began preaching, a slightly different method from regular Orthodox Christianity, and that because of it, the Romans felt he was a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker, and he was arrested, tortured, and then executed by the Romans. Christians believed that 3 days afterwards he came back from the dead, and in fact was what the Jews called the Messiah, the Savior of the world. Again, we are not here to argue about the rightness or wrongness of this. I'm only here to give you the historical record. And the historical record is that, to be honest, outside of some biblical sources, there is no contemporary evidence of the personage known as Jesus in the Roman world. The Romans have no records of him whatsoever, and there's some contradictory things here. This is not to say that a Jewish mystic and preacher did not live, but historically we don't have the evidence of the type of person described in the Bible about him. But regardless, he was still considered a person who probably had lived and who was very influential in the rest of the world. After Jesus' death, a small group of Jews continued on the message. For the most part, they were prosecuted not only by the Romans, but these early Christians were prosecuted by fellow Jews, because the original Christians were Jews. But perhaps the most important of these disciples was a man who never even met Jesus, a man by the name of Paul. Paul, whose original name was Saul, was converted to Christianity and decided to spread the new religion out to the rest of the world. You can see from the maps here that he was pretty darn successful. He had gone into areas like Cyprus, into what is now Turkey, into Asia, to spread Christianity. Some would argue his own version of Christianity to the people, and the people were very receptive. Eventually, records show, he actually got into Greece to spread the Christian gospel, and eventually even Rome itself. As you can see here, he took many different journeys around. Eventually, Christianity would find its place in Rome. And when the Roman Empire fell, it was really the only large structure able to keep things going. The head of the church in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, was nicknamed by his followers as Daddy or Dad, head of the church, which in Latin was Papa, which eventually became the term Pope, which is why we speak of the head of the Catholic Church as being the Pope. As you can see here, there were many popes going on during the time, and there were over, to our time, the line of popes continues. Islam is the third great religion coming from the Middle East. Its origins, as you're very much aware of, is of Arabia. where a merchant by the name of Muhammad said that he had a revelation. The revelation was copied down, and Islam was born. Saudi Arabia at the time was a bustling place for trade. Many of the people who lived there were tribal members and so forth. The early inhabitants of Arabia were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. So when Muhammad came along with his message, which many scholars are believed are heavily influenced by Christianity and Judaism, there were many people within Arabia who took that message to heart because it gave them something that was similar to the other nations around the world. It is said that Muhammad, after he was chased out of Mecca, eventually returned, and that he went into the Kaaba, which is the great cube in the center of the city, and destroyed all the pagan gods there. And in its place, he left only one representing the God that both the Christians and the Jews worship, and which he called Allah. As I mentioned before, Muhammad said that he was instructed by an angel on the tenets of Islam. His followers wrote it down. I don't know why I have a picture of Adam. Oh yes, Islam believes or accepts the divinity, not the divinity, excuse me, but the of the prophecies of the great leaders of Christianity and Judaism. Whew. It is believed by Muslims that all these men, Adam, Abraham, Moses, I'm missing one, and Jesus, were all given the word from God, but that their followers misinterpreted the word, and because of the misinterpretation, that these people are worshiping God in the wrong manner. The claim of Muhammad is that he received the final message, and the final message is perfect, and it is the last great revelation. Most people who are non-Muslims are very surprised that Muslims look at personages that are important to Judaism and to Christianity and accept them as part of the religious structure. But in the case of Muslims, of course, they do not see Jesus as an incarnation of God, but one of the great prophets of all time. Islam has, and you remember this from 7th grade, I hope, the 6 articles of faith, a belief in God or Allah. By the way, Allah is merely God's name. Just as you have a name and I have a name, that is God's name. In the nation of Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim nation, Christians there call God Allah. Without any irony, that's what they should call. They have the 6 articles of faith include a belief in angels, and of course we see that there may be a Greek origins to the belief in angels, the belief in the prophets that I shared with you just a moment, a belief in the divine books. Of course, the Quran is considered by Muslims as the greatest book of all. In fact, many Muslims will memorize its tenets to the word. By the way, a very interesting thing about Islam and the Quran is that any translation of the Quran is considered inferior to the real thing. If you wish to understand it perfectly, you need to learn to read and speak Arabic. This is one reason why Muslims say, and they do have an important point, why the Jewish Old Testament and the Christian New Testament have so much problems with interpretation. It's because nobody reads ancient Hebrew, ancient Latin, ancient Aramaic, and so on and so forth. We get this in English. There are some people in the United States who believe, in fact, that Jesus actually spoke English, which is weird. A belief in a judgment day, which Christianity has. By the way, Judaism doesn't have a judgment day. it doesn't work that way at all. And finally, a belief in fate, that some things are preordained by Allah, and it happens through His will. You also remember the tenets of Islam from 7th grade, that of faith. One who becomes a Muslim recites the idea of there is no God but Allah publicly, and that is part of what makes you a true Muslim. Hours set up for prayer. If you are truly devout, you'll try to pray 5 times a day towards Mecca. The idea of fasting during the month of Ramadan, many of you are very familiar with that. The idea of, I hope I'm saying this right, zakah, which is very, very close to the Jewish term tzedakah. Tzedakah is giving to the poor. Zakah is the same sort of thing. Both languages have the same origins, to give up some of your wealth. And the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, you try to do that once in a lifetime. During the COVID-19 epidemic, of course, the Hajj has been postponed. Very few people are getting into Mecca in order to stem the disease. Under the leadership of Muhammad, Islam spread throughout Saudi Arabia, and eventually, even after his death, it spread all over the Middle East and even to Europe itself. The northern part of Africa had been almost completely Christian before this time, but the message of the Prophet was considered superior, and so people converted. It got as far as Spain, as you can see, and there are still remnants of Islamic culture in that country. I mentioned before when we looked at my DNA, because my ancestors, some of my ancestors come from Spain, that there is some Middle Eastern, North African blood in me, and it may be from those original conquests many centuries ago. The Islamic armies got as close as a few hundred miles from Paris before they were finally defeated, and that was the last foray into Western Europe. You can see also that in the spread of Islam, that they would eventually take over much of the old Byzantine Empire, what was left of the Roman Empire, actually getting to the gates of the great city Constantinople. They moved over to the east as well, going to Armenia, Persia, Afghanistan, and this map doesn't show it, but Islamic influence reached all the way into Asia, of course, where, as I mentioned before, it is a massive religious force, as Indonesia, as I said, is the largest country with Islam. It went into steps, as you can see here. So where we are in the story is Rome has fallen. Christianity is well established in Europe. Islam is well established in the East. And just when things couldn't get any worse for Europeans, then came the Vikings. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, around Norway, Sweden, Denmark. They were great sailors, and they went down into Europe and elsewhere in order to, well, invade, get some land, get some treasure. But for the most part, the Vikings were interested in settling. They were not quite the bloodthirsty group that everyone hears about, although they did a lot of bloodthirsty things. And you can see Viking influence moving all the way down even to the boot of Italy, down into Russia. They went into and settled Iceland, had a settlement in Greenland, and even went as far as to go into what we would call the New World or the Americas. The American settlements don't last too long, mainly because it's so far away from home. Many people say, oh, Leif Erikson discovered America. Well, one could argue he didn't, because when he returned, he didn't keep anything permanent, and he didn't tell the rest of the world what he had found. So I don't think we can give him credit for the European discovery of America. Yeah, right. Why is this not coming up? All right, good. When we think of the Middle Ages, of course, we think of the Crusades. And the Crusades is what would help to get Europe back on its feet. Here was the situation. It's the year 1000. Much of what was once Christian is now in Muslim hands. North Africa, much of the Middle East, Spain, and so forth. This is scary for Christians. The Byzantine Empire in purple that you can see in the map is a mighty empire, but it's in decline. Christians believed in those days that Jesus was going to come back in glory. And they convinced themselves that the year 1000 was when it was going to happen. But the year 1000 came and went, and Jesus didn't return. And so Christians who really didn't do too much because they thought the end of the world was coming, realized that maybe they were wrong about the date and decided maybe we should start picking up the pieces of what's left of Europe, put them back together. Europe at this time was very different than how we know it today. We can see here that Spain is divided into what is now 3 countries. France is not a country in and of itself. There is no Germany. There is no Italy. There are lands that eventually, one day, will be Russia and Poland, but they are just getting started. It was this man, Pope Urban II, who gets the ball rolling almost 100 years after the millennium, that is to say, around the year 1100. Pope Urban II had a major problem. Europe was the most barbarous of all the continents on Earth. Asia was incredibly civilized. The Muslim empires and kingdoms were at their height. The greatest poetry, the greatest institutions and all. Africa had great empires, for example, as in Mali. But Europe is where the barbarians lived. And the problem for Pope Urban II was he wanted Europe to be a land of, well, civilization. And one of the problems he had were the princes, the leaders within Europe, who were barbarians, who were killers, who were basically gangsters with swords. He needed a way to control them, to take that energy and put it somewhere else. He came up with an idea that's considered pretty infamous today. He reasoned out that all this extra manpower, these killing machines, these barbarians, could better be used in the service of the church. So thought Urban, why not send these barbarians into the Middle East, into the land of the Saracens, which is what they called the Muslims back then, and liberate the Holy Lands. Thought Urban II, I will solve a few problems by doing this. I'll get rid of all of these monsters, let them do killing elsewhere. And secondly, with these people gone, I can reorganize Europe and have it work. Most of you are already aware that the call for crusades worked. And it worked because the popes, following Urban and following Urban, came up with a formula that no one could would refuse. They said to these barbarian leaders and to their followers and to the regular ordinary people, look, you want to die, and when you die go to heaven? They said, yes, of course we do. It says, have I got a deal for you. Go on a crusade. You go down a crusade, you're going to get glory, you're going to get riches, you're going to get, everything you ever wanted. And, they said, if you die while going on a crusade, you will go immediately to heaven. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. You go to heaven directly. This idea was appealing, and thousands upon thousands of people answered the call to the different crusades, marched into the Holy Land in order to liberate it. And again, if they died, so what? They go to heaven. This cynical use of people's hopes within religion was used by a church in order to achieve very different goals. Now, there are 4 major crusades, which shows that the first crusade, in the end, turned out to be a failure. And for the next 100 years, attempt after attempt after attempt to liberate the Holy Land went and failed. The results of the Crusades are many, and I have a big list for you. I'm not going to go through this list with you. I'm just going to give you some of the highlights. But the results of the Crusades did something that Urban and the other popes or the people of Europe could never expect. It changed everything in that continent. Christians who went into the Middle East, many of them looked at the people they were supposed to be conquering and killing and realized, hey, they're just like us. They may worship God in a different way, but they're just like us, and established trade. It didn't hurt that after the First Crusade, Christians had a number of kingdoms that failed eventually. But as you can see from the map over to the right, a great network of trade was established. So Christians in Europe would be able to get goodies that were unknown or forgotten since Roman days. Because in the Middle East, in the Muslim lands, they used money. Money then began being used once again in Europe, replacing barter. During the time of the Roman Empire, of course, there was money. But when it fell, money lost all of its ability to buy and sell things, and people merely traded back and forth. By putting money into people's pockets, it gives them a new exciting activity called buying things. And Europeans wanted a lot of luxuries that the peoples in the Middle East had for themselves. You're very familiar with this one. The Crusades brought in new spices and new cuisines. Europeans saw for the first time different ways of preparing food that they had been preparing the old ways for quite a long time. What really hit them were all the different spices that the folks in the Middle East had, which Europeans had either forgotten or had never seen before, especially that super spice called pepper. Now, the Muslims, of course, were trading with far-off nations such as China, India, Japan, and so forth for these goodies. Now Europeans wanted them as well. And for quite a long time, Europeans traded with the Arab nations for the spices that they need. It wasn't until the prices started going up for the routes that Europeans were not able to get the spices that they want. But we'll get into that a little bit later. By the way, got to get rid of a myth about spices and the Europeans. Many people say that the Europeans got spices in order to disguise the taste of their food, because they would get a bit of fish or they would get a bit of meat. They would put a lot of pepper on it because the meat was spoiled, and this was a way to make sure that you could eat the meat and without being disgusted by the fact that it was gone bad. That's a bunch of baloney, because even no matter how much you spice bad food, it's still going to kill you. And the Europeans were not stupid. They understood you couldn't spice it. But, you know, that's still taught in elementary school and so forth. So keep that in mind. But again, all these spices and stuff really are motivating for Europeans. As I mentioned before, the spices came from all over the world, including China, the East Indies and so forth. And this, by the way, gave to the Europeans a great deal of curiosity on what is beyond the Arab nations. What is in India? What is in China? What sort of stuff do they have that we're not getting? And that curiosity, of course, would spur the motivation to find a route to that part of the world. The Crusaders found themselves face to face with brand new innovations they had never seen before. For example, the Arab nations had almost perfected, if that's the right word, dentistry. In those days, if you were a European and you wanted to get your teeth done, for the most part, it was either, you were either knocked out and the tooth pulled out, or, they just left it to fester, and you can die from that. The Muslim lands had very sophisticated types of dentistry that could fix things. It's my understanding they even had a form of braces to fix crooked teeth. Many Christians in Spain would go down into the Muslim part of that of the Iberian Peninsula just to get their teeth fixed. It was because of the Crusades and the Arab lands that Europeans learned the value of taking a bath. Europeans had this very strange belief that bathing was bad for you, that if you bathe, especially if you bathe in hot water, it would bring in some, like the germs and stuff that would kill you. In some cases, peasants would walk around with bodies caked with dirt because they thought that was healthy. But when they saw that the peoples of the Middle East bathed, they were clean, they didn't die from diseases. In fact, they had less disease than the Europeans. It made them, when they returned to the cold and drafty castles of France and England, to bring back the innovation of nice hot baths. They brought in a new type of sail to the Europeans, which helped them to explore the world. The triangular sail called the Lateen sail. Before this time, Europeans used straight sails, and straight sails, squares, are great. If the wind is strong, they'll put you in the direction you want to go. But if there's no wind or very little wind, your big sails are not going to do too much good for you. This is one reason why the Romans had oarsmen to row the boats. The Lateen sail is an incredible innovation. The Chinese had it first. And this allowed for you to move the sail to catch the wind. And when you sailed with a Lateen sail, you went in a zigzag pattern. But it meant that you could sail with almost any wind coming in almost any direction. Europeans got from the Arabs rhyming poetry. European poetry really wasn't worth the name. But with this innovation, it changed European literature completely. New types of mathematics started coming into Europe from the Arab world, especially algebra, which most of you recognize as an Arabic word. They also brought in innovations in numbers, so-called Arabic numbers, which are really from India, the symbols that we use for 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. I'm not quite sure if I have something there for it. There were many, many others, but I'll stop at that. Europe looks like it's on its way out from the problems of the fall of Rome. And then in the 14th century, something hits that no one could ever expect. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death, caused by Yersinia pestis. It is believed by scholars that the bubonic plague began in what is now Russia, not too far from Kazakhstan. The plague had originated there and spread throughout Europe, but it was not until the 14th century that it hit very, very strongly. We can see between the year 1346 and around 1353 the spread. It spread here, started here near the Black Sea, and as people tried to escape the plague, they took the plague with them. It moved into the Byzantine Empire through ships. It got into Rome. It got into Greece. It got into the islands like Sardinia. Within the year after that, it spread through much of Europe. In 1349, it had spread into most of Western Europe, including the Scandinavian countries, and finally into Germany in the 1350s, into what is now Poland by 1351, and by 1352 had gone even into Russia itself. The bacillus for the plague was carried by a flea. Fleas, as you know, are like mosquitoes. They're parasites. They come up, land on you, and they take a big bite, suck what blood they can get from you, and then they go their merry way. A flea that is infected by the plague bacillus will transmit that to you. Now, in those days, fleas were everywhere. Everybody had fleas. And so one extra flea bite really didn't matter, because most people would have 3 or 4 flea bites per night, and scratching and itching from them was just something, well, ordinary. Everyone suffered with it. The flea's original host was the black rat. The fleas jumped on the black rat, feasted, and then the rats would get sick. When the rats got sick and died, well, the fleas then went into humans. Rats were the biggest spreaders of the plague because they were the ones who got into the ships, into the homes, into the sewers, everywhere. The effects of the plague are pretty nasty, as you can see here from this picture. Depending upon where it starts on it, your flesh begins to putrefy. It begins to turn black and ugly. You do get swellings like this young lady called bobos. These are the lymph nodes going. By the way, people still get the plague today, so these are not waxworks. These are actual victims from the past who have had it. If you got the plague, if you were lucky, you died very quickly. If you were unlucky, you died very slowly. Usually you died within the week. Most people had no idea where it came from. Most Christians believed it was punishment from God himself for whatever evils they may have done. Prayer was attempted, but of course prayer didn't work. And people began to question religion when they discovered that priests and nuns, important religious persons, got the plague too. What's going on there? There were many different plagues that happened in history, by the way. Just letting you know, and it'll give you an idea of how big this plague was. The third plague, down in 1855, killed about 12 million. HIV, the plague, the biggest plague in our lifetime, killed between 25 and 35 million people, and still killing today. The plague of Justinian, who we believe was also the bubonic plague, killed 30 to 50 million people. The Spanish flu, or the Spanish influenza, which most of you are aware of, 40 to 50, that was 100 years ago. Smallpox, we believe in the year 1520, killed 56 million people. But no one comes as close to the killing power of the Black Death, 200 million people in a relatively short time. It is believed that 1/3 to 1/2 of the European population died because of it. We are now, of course, in a type of plague today, in a pandemic anyway, not quite a plague, a pandemic. We are doing everything we can to protect ourselves. People are still getting it. But our plague still is yet to hit, and I hope it never does, 500,000. It is nothing to what has happened in the past. It must have been a terrible time. The aftermath of the Black Death, well, besides a lot of people's lives ending early, it changed the way that we lived. The survivors inherited money from the dead. And one of the first things that the survivors started to do was party, to have a good time. The idea of being pious, of being overly religious, was looked upon by the folks as something to be, well, kind of silly, because religion didn't save the people. Religion didn't save the priests and the nuns. Maybe what the priests and the nuns are saying about everything is a little bit wrong. Peasants found that their labor was now very, very valuable. After all, almost half the European population had been killed. And so peasants began to demand of the people who hired them more money. Look, you need 10 people to work your farm? Without us, you're not going to make any money, because all the wheat and stuff will rot on the vines. If you want us to help, you have to pay us twice as much as you did before the plague. And there was no choice. They had to. Now, this was great, because peasants got more money in their pockets. And with more money in their pockets, they began to spend. And just like any sort of, package where money gets into people's hands, it helps to lift the economy. We saw that just recently with the $3 billion meant to restore the economy soon after COVID hit. Back then, it restored all of Europe. With more money, that means people could live, let us just say, better, and they could also improve themselves. Use that extra money to, let's say, get a better marriage for your daughter, or give your son a better education. And of course, this meant that peasants no longer had to be peasants. And this then helps us get into the Renaissance, because this is where it all comes together. The Crusades, the Black Death, the advent of new ways of thinking. There is no place where the Renaissance actually began as, hey, this is where it began. So this is as good as any. I introduced you to Manuel Chrysoloras, who lived from 1355 to 1415. He was a Greek who lived in Constantinople, and in one of the attempts by the Turks to take over the city of Constantinople, he fled that city and went into Greece and then went into Italy. He brought to Italy his books, but most important, his knowledge, because people in Italy were very interested in the learning that Chrysoloras had. He had spoken, he was a learned man. He spoke about all the wisdom and so forth that they got from the Arabs. He also brought back with him many books which had been lost to the West, like books by Aristotle and Plato, and so on and so forth, with knowledge that Europeans thought was dead. Chrysoloras also, when he returned, began a course in Greek and Roman languages and culture, and eventually led guided tours through Greece and through Constantinople, because it wasn't taken over at that time, for Europeans who wanted to get a little bit of culture. And the place where Chrysoloras really began is the place that's in red, in the area of Florence. Florence sits pretty much in the middle of Italy. It is the place where all trade passes through, but not only trade, but ideas, innovations. And it is here in Florence where the Renaissance is going to begin. I mentioned before, Chrysoloras brought in books from authors that were thought lost. The people who traveled with Chrysoloras and others later on went into the Greek world, the Roman world, traded with the Arabs for books that they had never seen before or thought had been gone, brought them back into Europe, read them, translated them, and then took off from there. These folks who started learning about old-time ways of doing things thought of themselves as pretty awesome. They were no longer concerned with all the teachings of the church and thought one of the most important things to be is a good person. They were so full of themselves that they began to call themselves humanists, because they felt that they were interested in all of human knowledge and maybe progress to come. They were interested in the writings of the past. They were interested in what is going on now. They were interested in learning as much of everything that could be learned. Among the most important innovations founded by the humanists was something called perspective painting. And perspective painting would really help bring the Renaissance about. If you take a look at the picture over to the left, you can see, this is a pre-Renaissance painting, you can see that the church is big, but you have the monks, which are pretty darn big themselves. The city inside the walls are not proportional at all. It's a mishmash of seeing things. Before the Renaissance, when you painted not what was truly there, but you painted in what was considered God's way of seeing things. Here's another example of pre-perspective paintings. What do I mean by this? Take a look at this painting here. This is in a church in Florence, and this is part of a chapel. Now, this thing is absolutely huge, and you probably can't see it too well on the small screen, but when you rewatch this, you'll be able to see a little better. I'll highlight bits and pieces for you, however. This is drawn in the pre-Renaissance style. But take a look. The area that I have here marked in red, you can see these are the bishops. These are the leaders of the church. Look how big they are. Look at the church behind them. The church is big, but they're big as well. From the point of view back then, what was important was God's perspective, how God saw you. And in their eyes, the more important you were in the eyes of God, like these bishops and so forth, the bigger you were in God's eyes, the more important you were in the picture, and so you are made to look big. Look at all these dancers. They're bad because they're dancers. They're in show business. In the eyes of God, according to their beliefs, they were unimportant. They're all going to, when they die, they're not going to go to heaven. Everybody knows that. And so they're drawn or painted as tiny. Take a look here. Here's a picture of the pearly gates of people going into heaven. Over to the right, you can see the newly dead. They're dressed in white. Look how small they are. But look at the saints, who are large because they are saints. The moment these little guys go in, they become theologically very large as well. Again, it's a weird way of looking at things, but that's how it is. And Jesus, he's the biggest thing in the picture. During the Renaissance, once they started getting all these humanist ideas, they began to see human beings in the sense of where we are in proportion to the rest of the world. Where did perspective painting come from? From the Middle East. Ibn al-Hazan, a Arab scholar, did a lot of research, or did a lot of thought about how we see things. And he was the guy who came up with the earliest theories of perspective. A man by the name of Toscanelli, an Italian, was an expert at Al-Hazan and had heard about some of these teachings and wanted to apply it to painting. He understood the geography. He understood the ideas of perspective and how we can see things differently than the painters did. He met up with this guy, Filippo Brunelleschi, who had been told that his job was to build a dome up here. You can see the picture in Florence. But Brunelleschi had no idea how to do it until he started talking to Toscanelli. Toscanelli convinced him that if he used Al-Hazan's ideas of perspective, that he would be able to build the cathedral. The story was this. Brunelleschi was outside the place of the church at a building called the Baptistry, and then using the ideas of perspective, painted a picture which from the eyes of the people looking at it was indistinguishable from reality. By creating or rediscovering perspective painting, Brunelleschi was able to create his great dome. But artists who picked up on the idea said, hey, let's do it ourselves. Take a look at this, and this will be the last thing I'll do today. Take a look at this. This is a painting by the early Renaissance painter called Masaccio, called Trinity, the Trinidad, from 1427. It's in the same church where you saw that big painting that we did before. Here's a picture in a chapel of Christ on the cross. But etched into the painting, even today, we can see the lines of perspective that Masaccio used in order to make it look like you were looking at something, that you were standing at the foot of the cross and looking at how it was done. The church itself was created using perspective. And soon everyone else was using perspective too. Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and others. In fact, they even built cities based on this idea. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop here because I know you had enough. You probably are a little bit bored. I hope you're not, but you might be.